something which MAGA supporters, it drives me up the wall. Like I said from the very beginning, NATO was a pact that says the United States controls your foreign policy in exchange for a level of protection, right? In other words, we get to tell you what to do. So we say jump, you say how high.
To act on its own terms.
I just said that. I just said that. You can't tell someone to stand up and defend themselves and then get mad at them when they do that and then tell you to go self. You can't do that. Right, okay. I haven't watched this yet. It's an interesting topic given how the world's going at the moment. So I'm going to click play and we're just going to check this thing out. So here we go.
For more than 7 decades, NATO has operated on a single premise: America will show up. Not just politically, but in force. Through its troops stationed across Europe, its intelligence networks overhead, and its nuclear umbrella in the back. That promise turned the alliance into something more than a pact. It became a central pillar of the liberal order, tying together dozens...
Okay, that isn't entirely true. I was wondering when I started watching this how much I would actually agree or disagree with it, and I guess we're kind of at something of a disagreement. When NATO was first established, the United States basically said to them, listen, you give us control over your foreign policy and we'll offer you a level of protection. However, something you have to understand, a lot of the other sort of non-US members of NATO, especially in the early stages, basically went to the United States and says, okay, well, if we get attacked by the Soviets, you have to come in military force and protect us. The United States made it clear back then that that wasn't what NATO was exactly. It doesn't say that like the other states will come in with force and use military power to absolutely protect their allies. It says that allied members of NATO will do what they can, basically. And if they feel do what they feel is necessary. So basically, like, let's just say that, you know, Poland gets attacked by Russia. The United States could turn around and say, well, listen, we think you have the capacity to end this war by yourselves, but it's within but we're going to send you, say, military aid or finances or something, or just a card saying good luck, because we think that's all you basically need to sort of survive this. It doesn't say the United States will absolutely come gun-hoing in with all its military might and wipe off the face of the earth anyone who invades a NATO country. That isn't what it is. In fact, the United States, when they were starting NATO, specifically said, hey, this isn't the United States will come whatever happens to your aid pact. They were very, very keen to say that's not what it was.
...of militaries into a single integrated war-fighting machine. In doing so, NATO went on to become the most powerful and most successful military alliance in history. But that assumption is no longer as firm as it once was. In Washington...
Again, I'm going to push back a little bit here too. I mean, was NATO one of the world's most... Well, I say was, like it's gone. Is NATO one of the world's most successful alliances? Yes. However, it's worth pointing out the alliance has never really been tested. The only time it was ever tested was, like, historically, was after 9/11, where the United States declared Article 5. And, like I said, not every member of NATO jumped in. Some of them, like the UK, and offered military support and were there toe-to-toe helping them. Others, it was mostly a bit of financial help or intelligence sharing. You know what I mean? That's kind of what I was saying before. It's like, it's not like everyone jumps in with everything they've got. That's not how Article 5 or the Alliance is built. So to say it was successful is kind of like saying, you know, if a guy has in a relationship has never cheated, saying, oh, he's such a successful, amazing guy, but the guy's never left his house, so he's never been tempted. It's like you don't get praise if you've never, like, gone through the thing. At least that's kind of how I see it.
The strategic focus is shifting. It's moving toward Asia, where the rivalry with China is seen as more consequential, more demanding, and ultimately more pressing in the decades ahead. In that context, NATO is increasingly seen not as a cornerstone of American security.
I'm guessing he's going to say, but as a drain, as an expense, as a cost, because NATO is primarily set up as a defense against Russia. Russian aggression. It's not really well positioned for Asia, especially given the fact that outside of the United States, no other NATO member power really has that level of power projection. So it's more of a hindrance, I guess, is what it's going to say here.
But as an outdated commitment that ties down resources and locks US power projection to a region that no longer holds strategic weight. Trump has been skeptical of NATO since taking office. So what happens if he follows through and America stops showing up?
I'm just going to say really quick, I think, this is my personal view on it, if NATO did dissolve, European Union or the European NATO powers certainly have the capacity to defend themselves. They've given up, though, over decades, kind of like, a muscle that you just no longer flex. Like I said to begin with, the agreement is that NATO members effectively give up their autonomy to the United States. So for decades and decades now, the United States has basically dictated policy, foreign policy. And countries like France would quibble about it, but ultimately it's like, hey, you're in for the right, you're in for a penny, in for a pound. If you're in this, you're in this. So a lot of the other countries just kind of got used to the United States being the one who says, this is how we do things. The problem now is that if the United States goes out, it's like, okay, how do you untangle yourself from that, like, massive knot of mess? How do you sort of untangle that so that you have a separate, independent system? And then number two, who governs it? Because if the United States was the one calling the shots, because they were the bigger power, who governs it now? I mean, the French, out of all of them, the French are the ones who kept themselves the most independent, so they're probably the most experienced. But would the UK follow France's lead? Would Germany follow France's lead? Canada basically would end up becoming more integrated into the United States. I know that I live in Canada. I know that Canada wants to kind of, at least in part, disconnect some of itself and make itself more autonomous. But the reality is that it's America's hat, whether it likes it or not. That's just the cold, hard reality on that one.
Suppose the United States, for whatever reason, steps away from NATO, the alliance wouldn't disappear overnight. Most, if not all, commitments remain in place. The institutions continue to function, and the member states are still there. On paper, NATO would survive, but in practice, something far more important breaks down.
Yeah, because just like I was saying before, it's like the foundational infrastructure, the logistics, the intelligence, everything is all built on American systems. It's all integrated into the United States. So if the United States pulls out, you've basically got an alliance separate to the US, effectively having to decouple itself from the United States infrastructure. So the second question becomes, like I said before, well, if you're no longer following the US's lead, which infrastructure do you tie it to? Now, the Europeans are trying to build their own infrastructure, but the European problem has always been, and still is, if you have to call the Europe in a crisis, who do you call? In the United States, you call the president. There is no version of that in Europe, at least none with the authority to actually act, because each member state has its own military. And in that regard, the EU isn't a superpower. It's just a glorified marketplace.
You see, NATO has been built around American capabilities that are not easily replaced. Take logistics as an example. Modern warfare depends on speed, the ability to move troops, equipment, and supplies across long distances in a matter of days. The United States carries most of that burden through its strategic airlift fleet with roughly 270 heavy aircraft, including C-17s and C-5s. By comparison, European allies collectively operate just over a dozen aircraft in that same class, with most of their capacity tied up in smaller A400M and C130 fleets.
Long story short, the European Union and Canada, and I may as well say it, pretty much, well, apart from perhaps the Poles and a couple of others, just effectively used the money they weren't spending on defense to just inflate their governments and their welfare states. So the United States has Okay, it's going to sound bad, and I've argued with MAGA people who've said this before. The US is not subsidizing NATO. Every nation pays into its own defense budget. So the money that America has been spending on its defense has been going towards the defense of the United States. No one forced them to do it. There is no pot of money. There is no bank account called NATO spending, which everyone pays into. That's not how it works. What's happened is that the European Union in particular has got very used to the presence of the United States and the assumption that the United States was, broadly speaking, on their side and that they would have access to things on friendly terms. That's what's changing. It's kind of like, you've a manager or an employer has let you go, but your life is still very dependent on the infrastructure that you were using before. That becomes tough. And the Europeans should have been spending time building up their own infrastructure. But then again, the issue is this. It's like, well, if I'm using this and it works super well, why would I waste resources building a counter to it if I'm constantly expecting it to be there and to be comfortable and be usable, That's the counter argument.
Europe can still deploy forces without the US, but not at the same scale or speed. Then there is intelligence. American satellites, surveillance aircraft, and reconnaissance systems provide a constant stream of data, tracking movements, identifying targets, and building a real-time picture of the battlefield. The Pentagon operates hundreds of military and intelligence satellites supported by a large fleet of surveillance aircraft, from AWACS to signals intelligence platforms and long-endurance drones. By comparison, Europeans rely on a handful of national satellite systems and...
Yeah, so we're basically kind of going over what I've already said here, which is that the United States is basically the scaffolding, it's the foundation, it's the load-bearing structure that underpins NATO, that makes it work, that makes it smooth, that gives it direction. That is the United States. So the question then becomes, if the United States leaves, well, the rest of NATO members will have to find a way of decoupling themselves from it, or the United States could charge a fee to use its infrastructure, but then you have a potential adversary which you are intimately connected to, and that presents a big problem from a European perspective.
A much smaller pool of surveillance aircraft, many of which are shared through NATO. To be clear, the capability is there, but it is limited and fragmented. If the American layer is removed, coordination across Europe becomes slower, less certain, and more dependent on national systems that were never designed to operate independently at that scale. Missile defense and long-range strike capabilities follow the same pattern.
Yeah, it's like the infrastructure just isn't there. The British have their own versions of things, but it was all designed to plug into a larger American system. They don't have a version that can operate at the scale that the United States has.
The US military can intercept incoming threats and strike deep into contested areas. Systems like Aegis and the B-2 make that possible. Those capabilities don't just add firepower, they shape the battlefield before it is even engaged. Without them, European militaries would have to operate closer to the threat, with fewer options and higher risks. And then there is the command structure itself. NATO's integration has always revolved around American leadership, planning, and coordination. It's not just about who gives the orders, but also about how those orders are executed through standardized procedures and shared platforms.
Exactly. So right now, everything kind of goes through based on an agreed American-based infrastructure and networking system. So orders come through and they're relayed. Effectively, NATO is other countries coupling themselves onto the United States system. So, you have Polish fighters working alongside American fighters, or working alongside Italian fighters, working alongside Canadian fighters, all using the American infrastructure. Because it's all standardized and all works. If that gets taken away, now you have all these people all having to rely on their own infrastructure, which isn't as good, or was bought from the United States. And so you have to ask the US for permission to maintain it and upgrade it, which is a fee you have to spend. Like, there is no large, scalable alternative. There just isn't. I mean, I suppose the only other one that could be comparable could mainly be like how the Chinese system works. But the Europeans are not going to go to the Chinese and be like, hey, can we use yours? Like, the European Union just does not have a comparable network built up. And like I said before, because there's no one person to make decisions where they can go, well, this person here who's elected is going to be the person who says what to do. All these other nations squabble, and they're all hoping to keep their peace.
Without the Pentagon at its center, Europe's command structure would no longer function in the same way.
True.
But NATO didn't just integrate armies, it made them dependent on each other, and above all, dependent on the United States. That dependence is best visible in the hardware. Many European militaries are built around American platforms, from fighter jets to missiles.
That's what I literally just said. Yeah, it's like so much of NATO's hardware or military capability is stuff bought from the United States. And because it's bought from the United States, part of the conditions is US companies and US personnel are the ones who have to, maintain it, repair it, upgrade it. If you're running a fighter jet, these fighter jets won't operate unless there's a software update, for example. Because they're basically flying fighting computers, effectively. And if the United States decide for whatever reason, okay, listen, we're going to shut your system down, then effectively your fleet, your fleet of fighter jets is grounded because they'll just shut off the network. Like, that's how integrated it is, and that's how dependent it is on the United States.
Systems. The F-35, for instance, is not just an aircraft. It is part of a larger ecosystem that connects sensors, communications, and targeting across multiple countries. That level of integration brings enormous advantages, but it also creates reliance. If the United States steps back, maintaining that ecosystem becomes more complicated for all sorts of technical and political reasons.
I'd argue it's not just complicated, it's borderline impossible. I mean, it's absolutely impossible because you'd have to fundamentally replace those systems. You're talking, billions upon billions of dollars have been spent over decades building up this network and building up these systems and building up this foundation, the foundation which holds this thing in place. If you just pull out of it, it's going to cost trillions of dollars to replace it all. And, we don't really have the decades and decades and decades to do the things we need to do with it, given the way the world's going right now.
However, none of that means Europe is defenseless. Far from it.
Well, no, like I said, Europe could defend itself. Europe certainly has the capacity to protect its own borders. What Europe doesn't have is power projection. The EU as a power does not have the ability to, say, project power to another part of the world, not in a large-scale coordinated way like the United States can.
European NATO members collectively field capable militaries with advanced technology and significant resources. The problem is that those capabilities are not structured to operate entirely on their own. So, while NATO as an organization wouldn't necessarily collapse with America's exit, it would no doubt face an unprecedented crisis. Article 5, NATO's core commitment, would become the focal point of the alliance's uncertainty. It wouldn't disappear, but its credibility would come under question. Responses would become less predictable, more conditional, and increasingly shaped by the political will of individual European states.
Yeah, because you no longer have the core US leading it. There's no longer a clear voice there that typically from the US president, which guarantees a sort of, you're in trouble, we will come to help, and other member states kind of coordinate and work around that. You now have a number of much smaller states, middle powers, all kind of been like, oh, well, we're not too sure, or, oh, maybe we could do this, or, oh, I heard this state's doing that, but we're not sure what they're doing. and it becomes a bit of a mess. That's the problem. Again, there isn't a one person you can call like the European president who actually is the commander in chief of the European military. That role doesn't exist.
And that uncertainty would have compounding ramifications. Deterrence depends as much on perception as it does on capability. If adversaries begin to question Article 5 and whether NATO will respond as a unified force, the threshold for testing that assumption lowers. Not through full-scale war, but through smaller, calculated moves, probing for cracks in the armor. Think of gray zone tactics, cyber operations, political interference, limited military actions, and so on. In every measurable way, Europe would have to reinvent its military posture in the air, on land, at sea, and in space. Strategic airlift would
because you'd have to replace all of this.
Need to be expanded, and intelligence networks would have to be strengthened, including satellites and surveillance systems. Missile defense would need to be scaled up, along with long-range strike capabilities that can operate without American support. A study by the International Institute for Strategic Studies puts a price tag on that gap. Europe would need to spend roughly $1 trillion over the next 25 years.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was. Yeah, think of how many decades you've had, like, since the Cold War. So you're basically talking, what, the 1950s until today? That's 70 years. You've had tens of billions of dollars spent, or hundreds of billions of dollars collectively spent on defense throughout that time. If this happened like now, you've got a much shorter window of time, and Europe has to be on it. So they're going to have to spend a lot of goddamn money. And this is a continent which has a shrinking economy, a shrinking population, and quite frankly doesn't really have the cash given how much debt it has and its other financial obligations through its welfare states. It's incredibly politically difficult. Like, Europeans love giving speeches, kind of like Canadians. Canadian governments love to give speeches. They are useless at action, absolutely useless. And it's mainly because they're so used to trying to convince others to help them out because they don't have the capacity to do it themselves. If you want reality check, that's the reality check.
Just to replace the conventional capabilities currently provided by the United States. That includes around 400 additional fighter jets, 600 main battle tanks, 20 destroyers, and 10 nuclear-powered attack submarines, along with dozens of missile systems, helicopters, and AWACS aircraft. Beyond hardware, Europe would also need to build out a new command structure to tie everything together. However, Europe's industrial base is not built for that kind of rapid expansion.
The reason for that is, I'm going to try to get ahead of this, is the United States is military-industrial complex. And I hate that phrase, but must be frank. The military-industrial complex is built around large-scale orders. So it's used to Europeans, Canadians, etc., ordering stuff from them. Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, etc., etc. They're used to getting large-scale orders, like, wholesale, I guess you could say. Whereas Europeans aren't really used to that. You don't typically get that many Brits. You'll get the Brits buying, say, American equipment, but they don't typically buy, say, French equipment. They're just not set up or integrated like that. So one of the things the European Union is having to do is just basically say, listen, if we're going to start being more independent militarily, we have to start prioritizing our own manufacturing base. We have to start building up our own military-industrial complex, so to speak. That's difficult because you have a lot of smaller companies which will take a couple of decades to really ramp up to the full-scale production, all competing for it. So, you've got, I'm trying to think of some names off the top of my head. I'll cut this bit out. So that's the problem, basically.
Production lines are limited, naval shipyards have shrunk, and political will is lacking. Land systems could be scaled up within a decade, but the air and naval sectors, where American capabilities dominate, are far harder to replace. France and Turkey stand out as partial exceptions. The French are working to increase annual Rafale fighter jet production to around 30 by the end of the decade. Meanwhile,
I mean, the French are the only ones out the Europeans, frankly, which try to maintain a level of independence, which in previous decades was always a bit of a pain for the United States and I dare say the Europeans. It's sort of like, hey guys, come on, get on board with the program. The great irony is with the way the world's changing right now, it's actually saved them because they've insisted on not like, you know, globalizing, so to speak, their primary infrastructures like their energy, their internet, their military capacity. They've kept it all in-house and maintained it. So if you compare the French structures versus, say, the British structures, or for that matter, the Canadian structures, there's no contest. Like the French have maintained their own ability to exercise power within their own like sphere of influence.
Turkey is currently building around 50 naval vessels simultaneously, including frigates, corvettes, submarines, and amphibious ships. But besides those two, few countries in Europe have the industrial base to scale production quickly. And even then, that trillion-dollar estimate covers only conventional forces and represents the bare minimum needed to defend Europe itself. It wouldn't give Europe the kind of global reach the United States has.
Okay, this is exactly what I was saying here. This is what I was saying before. Europe has the ability to defend itself. Like if someone came into Poland or came into France, they have the capacity to protect themselves. They have zero real power projective capability. Like the French, after they were attacked, the Bataclan, you know, the shootings in Paris, were able to go after ISIS fighters in North Africa, which is basically just across the Mediterranean, but they don't really have the capacity to go much further than that. Like you're not going to get a French battle group, say, off the coast of Taiwan. Like they don't have that capacity. That's the Europe's problem. They don't have that. They've basically piggybacked off the United States.
Or the ability to conduct sustained offensive operations beyond its own region. Technically, Europe has the economic capacity to make that investment. Its combined GDP rivals that of the United States, and it has resources needed if governments decide to follow through.
Okay, and here's where I jump in again. This is going to be quite a long video, it looks like. That is true. What Europe lacks, though, is the financial infrastructure. Like, if you look at the United States, you have the Fed, you have the Central Reserve, you have a main central bank, and you have all the states basically connected in some way to that. So, you know, if you're in, say, New Hampshire and you get into debt, you can borrow from the Fed, and then those imbalances within the United States financially, there's a counterbalance that takes place in, say, Texas and California or Vermont, etc., where, you know, things are equalized, so that it isn't really noticeable. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when you had the 2008 financial crisis and Greece was basically getting, how do I say this, financially, you didn't have that. So Greece had to borrow money from the European Central Bank and then repay it back as a loan, versus in the United States, you wouldn't necessarily have that problem. A state within the United States having financial difficulties would not collapse the American financial system. It just wouldn't, because it has the resilience to do it, because it has their own currencies and they have the infrastructure there. Europe doesn't. So if one state gets into trouble financially, it has the ability to collapse the euro. That's the problem. Very long-winded, and I hope that kind of makes some sense.
The real problem, however, is time. Replacing the removed American capabilities would take decades, and during that time, Europe would be exposed and vulnerable to coercion. In geopolitics, those who can't defend themselves get picked apart. For all the focus on what the United States brings to the alliance, Europe brings something just as important: geography. Access to that geography is what allows American power to extend beyond its own borders. Across the continent, the Pentagon maintains a network of more than 40 military bases, along with logistics hubs and pre-positioned equipment. Those are not just forward deployments aimed at Russia. They are staging grounds for operations into the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel, the Arctic, and Russia's western border. Remove Europe from the equation and America's reach becomes more limited, more distant, and more expensive to maintain. No amount of aircraft carriers can replace an entire continent.
That's true. That is true. That does have to be said. I mean, it's the United States certainly has the military power, but you know, if you're having to send a fleet of ships, you know, destroyers and aircraft carriers, etc., across an ocean to get from A to B, that takes a while versus having a base already near that border. You know, like if you have to defend, say, or if you have to protect your interests in Southeast Asia, having troops stationed in South Korea speeds that process up. Like you can get to where you need to get to pretty quickly. It also gives you time and stability to build things up there and to make sure things are good there versus having to rush in with, you know, a fleet of ships, basically.
Without its bases in Europe, America would be projecting power across 2 oceans, thousands of kilometers from any major conflict zone. Then there is the political layer. NATO has always provided the United States with something few other alliances can: political legitimacy. When Washington acts alongside NATO members, it doesn't appear to be a unilateral move. It looks like an international response with diplomatic weight.
That's what the United States ultimately wanted at the end of the World War II, going into the Cold War. Is that they basically said, "Look, listen. If you let us control your foreign policy, we'll offer a level of protection in exchange for foreign policy." It gave legitimacy, but it basically said this, like you said here, this wasn't an empire doing what it wants. This was a hegemon working with its allies to accomplish a goal, which is very different internationally. Optically, it's very different.
How actions are perceived and how they are resisted. So, without Europe, America would lose not only allies, but also political cover. Finally, there is the defense market. Europe may rely on US capabilities, but it is also the largest and most consistent market for American weapons. Over the past decade, roughly a third of US arms exports went to Europe, but since 2022, that share has grown even further. Poland, Germany,
yeah, that's because of the invasion of Ukraine.
The Netherlands and others have placed large orders for systems like F-35 jets, Patriot missiles, and HIMARS.
Yeah, so if the United States leaves and sort of, I won't say goes rogue, that's not the way I'd put it, but certainly decides that its interests no longer align, and so it's just like, okay, you're on your own now. Europe's incentives is going to be, okay, we need to stop sending our euros to the United States to buy their shit. We need to start building and buying our own shit at home, which ultimately I think is a better idea. It's certainly a more secure idea. If you have to depend on another country for your military supplies, that can be very dangerous. But then again, you know, 20 years ago, no one thought we'd be having this conversation. So yeah, it's that will impact the United States, because suddenly you have an industry which is designed for large scale, suddenly losing a lot of its customers, and so the US's ability to make things for itself cheaper will get more expensive, because now it's like you're no longer selling wholesale to a lot of people. Now you're selling specific orders. And so, you know, anyone who's doing renovations of the house knows when you get things custom, the price goes up versus buying stock, which is cheaper.
The F-35 program alone involves more than a dozen European countries with hundreds of aircraft, either ordered or planned, locking them into decades of maintenance, upgrades, and integration with US systems. Those acquisitions are not just commercial deals. They sustain a significant portion of the US defense industrial base and reinforce long-term dependency.
Tens of thousands of jobs.
Without Europe, American defense giants such as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing would lose their biggest export market overnight.
There you go. That's exactly what I said. It's because they now go from being a large-scale wholesale exporter, they go to a much more smaller, when the US needs it. Costs go up, production time slows, etc.
Yet even taking all of that into account, and the mutual dependence between them, it is Europe that stands to lose the most from an American exit. The most profound issue would be political coordination.
I said this right from the beginning. I said it right from the beginning, right there. Who, well, to borrow Ghostbusters, not who you're going to call. Who are you going to call? Who are you going to call? Who takes the lead, ultimately? Who makes the final decision? In NATO, de facto, it's the United States. Just culturally, we've got used to that. The United States says, we're doing this, and generally speaking, other NATO members will go, okay, either yes, we'll join, but with X amount, so to speak. So how much they want to get behind it. With the US gone, what do you do? Who leads?
There are two ways it could go down. Most likely, NATO's decision-making could splinter along national lines, with members beginning to hedge. Instead of relying on a single overarching framework, they could build multiple layers of regional pacts. Western Europe, led by France and Germany, could push for a more centralized approach and attempt to restore the continent's military-industrial base. But that concept wouldn't fully align with the priorities of Eastern Europe. Poland and the Baltic states operate under a different timeline. For them, the threat is urgent, and so...
Yeah, I was going to say, for them, it's not like it is for the UK or, say, Spain or, like, France, where there's a risk there, but it's more of a intellectual conversation. For Poland, Slovenia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, it's an existential question, which is, we're going to be invaded at some point. We feel it in our gut. We have a strong sense for this. We've seen this film before, and we need the infrastructure there. So the reason why the EU is rushing is because, like, look, there's a very good chance some point soon you're going to have, Russian troops basically trying to make their way into Warsaw. And what are you going to do about that?
So they would focus on quick results rather than long-term integration projects. Either way, as countries assume greater responsibility for their own defense, coordination would become more difficult. Over time, European security would shift away from a single unified structure toward a mosaic of smaller alliances.
That's assuming, and here's where I think he's wrong, I think the European Union will ultimately be forced to, at least my hope is, to become more federalized. To give it a much more heavier central government. Because right now, despite what people say about the European Union does not have a, quote, central government. It just doesn't. It really doesn't. It has a collection of member states and MEPs who squabble about certain things, but there isn't a central government that sort of makes final choices. The problem there is like, how would the French president feel about a European president effectively commandeering his military or her military? How did Texas feel when Texas was a state before it became part of the United States, being told, okay, once you join, the president of the United States, the elected president of the United States, gets to decide what to do with the military. Now, each state has its own national guard, so to speak, but it's not the same thing. And Europe has to go ask itself that question. Do we want to fracture into sort of smaller chunks, which are easy to bite off, or are we going to unify into a federalized system? I'd rather they federalized, personally, but I'm a federalist, so what can I say?
Alternatively, suppose Europe adapts and finds a way to overcome its internal disagreements. Somehow, some way, unity is preserved, and in the decades following, Europe not only restores its capabilities, but undergoes structural change in the process. Defense spending, which had long been debated and delayed, becomes a baseline requirement. Industrial production scales up, not in response to a crisis, but as a permanent feature of policy. The new NATO that emerges rebuilds its command structure under European control, but that shift in power carries profound consequences. For decades, Europe's passive military posture was not just a weakness, it was intentional. The United States carried the burden of defense, but in doing so, it also retained control over the course of the alliance.
Okay, I said this right at the very beginning, and it's something which MAGA supporters, it drives me up the wall, right? Just like I said before, when they say things like, oh, well, the US carries NATO, the US carries NATO, the US carries NATO, you need to contribute more, blah, 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 blah. I agree NATO member states that are not the US should contribute more, but it misses a fundamental point. The United States, whenever Europe in the past tried to re-exert itself and to do more, the country which complained the most about it was the US. Because the US, like I said from the very beginning, NATO was a pact that says the United States controls your foreign policy in exchange for a level of protection, right? In other words, we get to tell you what to do. So we say jump, you say how high, under a NATO structure, okay? And in return, we're the big daddy. What the US is asking for now is to basically say, right, the European Union has to become a large power, equal in size roughly to the United States, but still do what the US says. That's not going to happen, right? Think about it in any other part of your life, right? If you have a situation where you're a business owner and you're smaller and someone else is a larger business owner and they're a supplier or something like that, and they basically sort of dictate certain policies to you, if you grew your business to the point where you're now a rival, you're not going to continue that. You're going to renegotiate your contracts, or you're going to go off and do your own thing. Because why would you? Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you walk away and do your own thing? You can't but demand someone else get as strong as you and that they do your bidding at the same time.
By assuming all security decisions, America discouraged nearly every major world power in history from restoring independent military postures. Dependence.
It was one of the first things the United States did after World War II. It literally prevented European powers from rebuilding their military. It says, no, you're not going to do that. We're in charge now. You don't need your militaries to be so big because we're going to look after you. And in exchange, you do what we say. That was the agreement.
Made it easier to keep allies in line. A Europe that relied on American protection had limited room to do otherwise. And so, with the exception of Russia, Europe's instinct to compete gradually wore away. Its geopolitics effectively froze. In and of itself, that is the art of NATO. However, that subjugated arrangement would not survive an American exit. The moment Europe is forced to defend itself, it also gains the ability to act on its own terms.
I just said that. That is exactly right. That is exactly right. Okay. If you can't tell someone to stand up and defend themselves and then get mad at them when they do that and then tell you to go yourself. You can't do that. Okay, that's not how it works. At some point, if they're going to get as big as you, they're going to want their piece of the pie.
That wouldn't be noticeable right away, but
over time it would be. Over time, 1000% it would be.
To 50 years of America's exit, Europe could very well emerge as a power center in its own right. And once that happens, the geopolitical clock would turn back to a time when relations between Western countries were conditional, negotiated, and at times contested. Altogether, stepping away from NATO would certainly reduce America's commitments, free up resources, and shift its focus elsewhere.
But it would also reduce its influence. That's the thing. What's happening with the United States right now, I agree, financially, to some extent, I kind of agree. In the short term, maybe. Long term, though, you've effectively created a situation in which the United States' ability to project power is diminished, because now you have other larger powers coming up saying, well, we don't want you in our patch. Or, okay, if you want to come here and do stuff, that's fine, but we want our money for it,